Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters on planet Earth. I am super excited today. We have our second podcast ever, and our guest today is Eric Berger. Eric is an amazing guy. He is the senior space editor at Ars Technica, and he also runs Space City Weather, a hype-free weather site for Houston and the Gulf Coast. And that has been probably at the top of your to-do list, Eric, huh? The last week or so.
Yeah, we had this enormous winter storm for Texas
I
that
heard.
knocked temperatures down into teens and shut roads down and then shut power down for like days and days and days, and then knocked out water, and it's just been a real mess.
Well, I know. So I live in the same town you do, right here south of Houston, and I know you're probably the most trusted person in Houston. People here love you, and normally it's hurricanes that we have every hurricane season. You know, your Space City weather work is super important, but you're kind of like the Walter Cronkite of Gulf Coast weather. But this was not. We don't normally have what we just had because we were texting, right? Like, how's it going? Is your power out? That was pretty crazy.
Yeah, so the last time that we really had a winter storm like this was 1989. So it's been more than 3 decades, and you just had this really big chunk of Arctic air that moved down and all the way into Texas, and it covered the entire state for the first time ever. All of Texas was covered by a winter storm warning. Even in the valley, temperatures were in the 20s. They had a foot of
Wow,
snow in some places down there. That was really insane.
that's crazy. It's not normally like that. So, but you're a meteorologist by training, right? From back in college.
Well, no, not even back in college. I started writing about weather almost 20 years ago, and in Houston, we had we had Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and then Hurricane Rita followed shortly after that. And so, if you remember, it was this really wild period in September of 2005. Katrina hit New Orleans. Conditions got so bad for people in New Orleans that hundreds of thousands of people from New Orleans came over from I-10 to Houston, lived with friends, lived with relatives, stayed in hotels, filled up the Astrodome.
Mhm.
And then 3 weeks after that, Hurricane Rita, another Category 5 hurricane, developed in the Gulf and looked like it was going to hit Houston. And so everyone who came here from New Orleans, everyone who lived in Houston, there were 1.5 million people who tried to evacuate from Rita, and actually like 2.5 or 3 million. And so I just got really interested in weather. And then a couple of years later, we had another hurricane, Ike, which did major damage on the coast. And at that point, I was like, well, if I'm going to write about this stuff, I was working for the Houston Chronicle at the time.
Mhm.
I thought I really better get some expertise. So I actually went back to Mississippi State University and did their meteorology program and
Oh wow,
completed.
I didn't realize that. So you did that kind of late in life.
I did, yeah, I did that late in life. I'm not sure that would be something I'd be up for now, but yeah, a decade ago, it was good.
Yeah, Rita was insane because I was on vacation in Colorado. We were at a pizza place and we were sitting there and I looked up and there was this giant spinning hurricane map. It was like one of those Hollywood disaster movies that's ridiculous and would never happen. Only there was this giant thing and it was like, whoa. And then so a couple weeks later, when the next hurricane hit, the entire nation's fourth largest city got on the highway and parked. And it took us 24 hours to get to Texas A&M, which is like a 2-hour drive normally. So that was crazy. So normally in Houston, this is a hurricane place, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. This year, like we got halfway through the Greek alphabet, like what happens if you get to Omega? Do you go to the Russian alphabet or the Arabic alphabet? Like what comes after Greek?
I don't know if they moved to the Latin alphabet or what
Uh,
or what happens, but
Roman numeral like Super Bowls.
right. I think that's probably would be like where we would ultimately end up. Fortunately, we had a long way to go in the Greek alphabet. This was only the second time we did this. That 2005 season we mentioned was the other time that happened. But it was, yeah, and so for Houston, it's just been kind of disaster after disaster because this past hurricane season was really busy in the Gulf. We saw some direct effects in Houston from Beta, and then from Hurricane Delta as well. Hurricane Laura at one time looked very threatening, and then just months later, we're hit by this winter storm. And now when you look at the calendar, Terry, it's three months and a week till the beginning of the 2021 hurricane season.
Oh my
So
God.
yeah,
Hey, spring training has started, so that's my
that's the
favorite.
good news. Yeah.
That's the good news. So I really want to talk about space because that's kind of your main thing. But while we're talking about weather, um, let's talk about climate change and how that is that causing this, or like if you look at the data, um, you know, how can climate change cause global warming and also a really cold spell? That's a question I have. I'm just a fighter pilot, so help me out.
Yeah, so my basic understanding of it is that there is this thing that's been much talked about in the press and popular culture called the polar vortex.
Right.
And the polar vortex is basically this atmospheric river of air circling around the pole that kind of keeps cold air essentially bottled up at the North Pole for the Northern Hemisphere. And sometimes when that weakens, the jet stream dives further south. And so you have the jet stream moving further south into the southern United States. And as the polar vortex weakens, this jet stream funnels or carries this colder air, down our way into the southern United States. And that's what happened is the polar vortex weakened. Some of this cold air at the pole spilled out and dove south into the continental United States. From a climate change perspective, there is some modeling that suggests that the polar vortex would weaken, like become less stable, and so you would get these kinds of events more often. But there's been nothing definitive that ties this past week's winter weather to climate change per se.
It
It's
might
very
just
much
be
up for.
it just happens sometimes, and
I mean, you look back in history, and Houston has had some winter storms.
right.
Back in 1895, there were 20 inches of snow in downtown Houston. Um,
Really? Wow.
yeah, yeah, and we've had some other winter storms. It's just been, as I say, more than 3 decades since we saw something like this, and so the
Yeah.
infrastructure was just not prepared for it.
Well, my air conditioner is on today, so balance has been restored to the force. We're back to normal. Houston, the heater came off after a week. It's back to air
Yeah,
conditioning.
we're more than 50 degrees warmer today than we were last Monday. So
Oh my God. That's amazing. We're filming this on a Monday. So a
yeah,
week ago, we were all frozen. Well, hey, you've got a new book out, right? Liftoff?
yeah, it's coming out on March 2nd,
Okay.
uh, and it's all about sort of the origin of SpaceX, and from the founding of the company, or before the founding, but it was founded in May of 2002, and they really struggled during those early years.
Yeah.
And it's kind of about the story of how that happened and sort of how they struggled through the first three launches and ultimately got to space in the fourth launch. And it just goes, it's really some rich storytelling about what actually happened, how they did it, and sort of who the key people, the key actors were there at that time.
They were pretty close to bankruptcy, right? In the 2000s.
Absolutely, yeah. So Elon founded the company. He put about 100 million in, and that allowed him to hire some great people. And so the book focuses on Elon, and then sort of about 10 or 12 of the key early hires. So some of the early vice presidents, their deputies, and the people who were doing, sort of the movers and shakers at the time. And there were a couple key points where it was actually NASA that stepped in to really save the company or help the company
Right.
along. And the first one was in the summer of 2006. So this was just 3 months after their first failure. And they had scaled up. They were more than 100 employees at the time, and NASA gave them some development money to study carrying cargo at the International Space Station. It was called COTS,
COTS, yeah.
and that was a couple $100 million, and that really allowed them to grow. And there are some doubts in my mind as to whether they would have actually made it through the three failures to get to the fourth flight, which happened in September of 2008, without that money from NASA.
Yeah.
So they made it. They actually finally succeeded in September of 2008, and they still had serious financial problems. Gwen Shotwell, the president of the company, told me that they had money for a couple of weeks of payroll, and that was it. Elon said that he couldn't even celebrate the success of the Flight 4 flight because it just meant that they weren't going to die that day. They still had
Right.
very serious money concerns. Like they had built they had built this Falcon 1 rocket, which was a single engine rocket, could carry, about 1,000 pounds to low Earth orbit. But
The
they only,
Falcon 1, right?
the
Falcon 1.
Falcon 1, yeah,
Yeah.
they only had one more customer after their successful launch, like, because the market had looked at these failures and said, well, we're not going to launch with these guys.
Insurance costs. Yeah.
Yeah. So like they would have failed if they hadn't gotten a second contract from NASA in December of 2008. That was the CRS, commercial resupply services, that ultimately allowed them to finish the Falcon 9 and cargo Dragon spacecraft.
So that was actually Mike Griffin, right? When that was during George W.'s administration, and Mike Griffin was kind of the person who drove that.
Mike Griffin was the originator of, or sort of the key mover in the early days of COTS. Yes, it was his vision that started that.
Right. It's an interesting point about presidential politics, because presidents always claim credit for what's happening on their watch, but SpaceX was started by George W.'s administration and Mike Griffin, and then it came to fruition during Obama and Charlie Bolden's administration. And with NASA, nothing ever happens quickly, as well as I do. And so it's just an interesting commentary about how people are happy to claim credit, right?
So Griffin and SpaceX have an interesting history. He's
Yeah,
not a big he's not a big fan of them now, but he was. So it goes back to 2002. He was one of the earliest advisors to Elon, and there was this meeting in the spring of 2002 at a hotel in Los Angeles, and Griffin had kind of gotten together. So this was before he was the NASA administrator. He had gotten some of the key people in the industry to come out there and meet with Elon and some of his people, and it was at that meeting that Elon announced he was going to start a rocket company. And a lot of
PayPal money, right? Well,
he had PayPal money,
right?
Yeah. So Elon had come to America, had sort of co-founded PayPal, and walked away from that with $200 million. And so he was looking around for something to do. He was interested in space, and he thought that originally he had the idea of buying a Russian rocket, ICBM, basically, to send a small payload to Mars, a terrarium, to see if you could put something down on the surface of Mars and then watch it grow. And he thought if you could live stream that back to Earth, it would be pretty inspirational. And then that would increase funding for NASA to do human exploration. Along the way, he decided that he would be better off building the rockets himself. So Griffin was one of the people he turned to for advice. And so he got up at this meeting and said he was going to found SpaceX. And a lot of the sort of experienced people in the industry said, no, don't do that. Go take your money, go sit on a beach. And, many people who've done this before have failed. And they were right. It's a great way to lose money.
Yeah.
However, he went to 5 people after this meeting to offer them roles as founding employees. And Griffin was one of them. He wanted Griffin to be the chief engineer for SpaceX.
It was a good choice.
and Griffin was living in Northern Virginia at the time, and he didn't want to move to Southern California. And Elon was like, well, if you're going to be on the team, you need to be here. And so it ultimately didn't work out. And Elon said he couldn't find anyone who was good enough who would accept the job, and those who would accept the job weren't good enough. So he just became the chief engineer himself of the company.
That is funny. What was Mike was the APL director then, the Applied Physics Lab, or he had some jobs in DoD too?
I want to say he'd already been at APL, because he had actually worked at another company in California called Amrock in the 1990s, actually late 1980s, 1990s. And Amrock had tried to launch a commercial rocket from Vandenberg, and they had failed. And Mike had become somewhat disillusioned, I think, with commercial space at the time. Right. So he has, as I say, Griffin has a 20-year history with SpaceX. Pretty interesting.
That is amazing. I didn't know that. Mike Griffin has an amazing resume. When you read his resume, you feel bad about yourself. Like, what have I done with my life? He's a smart man. I'm friends with him. I actually grew up down the street from APL, right off Route 29 in Columbia. It's the Applied Physics Lab in Maryland. And his wife, Becky, worked at my stepdad's company. It's like a small NASA engineering contractors, subcontractors. So anyway, we had a thing. So Elon is back in the 2000s. He moved to America from South Africa. So he's like the American dream, right? Immigrant, starts PayPal, makes money, wants to go into space. He's like one failure away from complete bankruptcy, and NASA bails him out. And then what's the point of SpaceX? Like it's about cost, right? Ultimately, if you make the cost of getting into orbit less, you can do more in orbit. Is that kind of their principle?
So one of the interesting things to me is that the point of SpaceX, its reason for existence, has not changed since he founded the company. Like literally when he founded the company, it was to send humans to Mars. That was the point. Like he would tell early hires, he would talk to them. He'd do interviews with him and talk about the fact that, he wanted this, he was creating this company to send humans to Mars. And so, he talks about that now, but that was the point even back then when they were trying to build this dinky little rocket. And so he's stayed true to that vision. Now, he thinks in his mind that the only way to really get enough stuff to Mars to support humans, as you well know, I mean, you need thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of food, water, habitat, consumables, clothing, fuel. I mean, it's just all this stuff.
A lot of stuff.
And so if you have a rocket that can carry 130 tons to low Earth orbit and launch it once a year, you're never getting close to Mars, right? So
what rocket might that be?
Yeah, well,
right. You're talking about the SLS, NASA's government rocket, if you will. It's called SLS, Space Launch System. Yeah.
And even if you could launch it 2 or 3 times a year, you still need like 8 or 10 of these for a single human mission to Mars, and the cost is outrageous. So he realized that the first step to getting to Mars, and there are many, to getting people to and from Mars, but the first step was bringing down the cost of launch. Because if you could have a rocket that you could fly often for a low cost that had a relatively high lift capacity, you could start to get the amounts of mass, the food, people, fuel, all the stuff you need for a human mission to Mars. You could start to get that off of Earth into orbit and on the way to Mars. And so that's why he started there.
And his technique for that, right, is reusability. Is that?
Yeah.
Would you agree? Okay. So the SpaceX rocket.
And by the way, they did try reuse from the very beginning. That first rocket launch in 2006, March had a parachute on the first stage, and they rented an Army recovery ship and sent an engineer out there to look for to try to get the first stage as it was coming back.
Wow, I didn't know that. So rockets are staged, right? If you can't just launch a single stage to orbit like we try to do in the 90s, because 99% of the rocket is going to be fuel. So you launch the big first stage. When it's out of gas, you drop it off. And then now it's a much lighter thing. So it's easier for the second stage to finish the job of going 25 times faster than the speed of sound. So when you have the staging, the first stage I think was going about Mach 5. On the shuttle it was. I'm not sure what the Falcon 9 number is, but so it only has to slow down from Mach 5 and come back to either a boat or the launch pad to land, which is amazing, by the way, to see these SpaceX rockets. And the first company to do it, the Blue Origin, they have a very similar thing. Their stage lands, but it's like a science fiction from a bad 1950s sci-fi movie that these things land. But the point I want to get, and the question I want to ask you is, that costs money and weight. You have to build landing gear, you have to have parachutes, you have to have heat shields, you have to save propellant to come back and land propulsively. However you're going to land, there's going to be a cost to that. So if you're going to reuse the first stage, it's less rockets that you can put into space, right? So there's that cost. I haven't sat down with a fine pencil and gotten detailed into it, but I guess SpaceX has done the calculation that the money they lose by launching less stuff into orbit is offset by the money they save by not wasting 9 rocket engines every launch. And is that true? Is that a valid calculation?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. When you launch a rocket and then try to bring the first stage back, you're paying a penalty because you have to save propellant to burn the engines when you come back through the atmosphere.
Right.
And you have to, as you say, you have to have landing legs, and you have to have flaps, and you have to have these other surfaces that help control the flight. And so they're taking probably a 15 to 20% hit to their payload capacity, I think is probably about what it is. And for most missions, that's fine because that's within the Falcon 9's capability to get stuff to orbit. You know, I think the economics of reuse are almost inarguable now, because SpaceX has not said publicly how much it costs them to launch a sort of a rocket for the second time, the third time, the fourth time. But previously their published price was $62 million for a Falcon 9 launch. I think they've offered prices for reuse of about 50 million, but the internal information I've seen is that it cost them less than $30 million to launch on a second stage. So like, it's probably half or less of what they were spending. And so if you use a rocket 7, 8 times, they've used first stages up to 8 times now, and they're going to get to 10 this year. If you sort of amortize that out over 8 launches, so you're saving what, 30 million a launch. So, you're saving a couple $100 million over those 8 launches. So it's
Right.
It's an incredible amount of savings. It only really works like if you're United Launch Alliance or you're the European Space Agency, the economics of reuse are much more difficult to make work, because you still got to have a factory to build rockets. You're still going to have a payroll. And if you're launching 5 times a year, it probably doesn't make sense to have a reusable rocket. But if you're launching 25 times a year, like SpaceX is, it makes a heck of a lot of sense. So it's not a simple, the economics of it are not a simple slam dunk. And that's one of the things that they're trying to do with the Starship program in South Texas. They're trying to make a reusable first stage and make it the entire rocket reusable. So you've got the first stage, the big booster, and then you've got the Starship upper stage. And the goal is to land both of those back on Earth.
Right, but getting the second stage back is a lot tougher. Then you need a space shuttle. You're right, because you're going so fast.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're going 25 times the speed of sound instead of 7, 8, or 9. Yeah.
Right. So that's more than 3 or 4 or 5 times harder. It's like the squared, 5 squared times harder. And you can't bring that back to the Kennedy Space Center and land it there, right? Where will they recover the second stage? In Ireland or Canada or?
No, Africa? Right now the plan is to land those either at a landing site relatively near the launch site, or they've just bought 2 large oil rigs, and they're being refitted now to be a launch and landing platforms for their Starship vehicles. So I think that they'll probably do that from the Gulf of Mexico, but they could also do that from the Atlantic Ocean.
Okay. But Starship is 2-stage, right? It has first stage and second stage?
The Starship vehicle, the Starship is the upper stage. And so the first stage called Super Heavy, you call it the Starship Launch System, or I don't know if they have a real name. Yeah, it is SLS. Yeah. On one of the early webcasts from Boca Chica, they called it the Starship Launch System. And I love that. I'm sure that was intentional.
That nothing is not intentional with Elon. That's funny. But I guess the second stage is going to go into orbit. So when it comes back, it can land wherever it, it's not like a Falcon 9 second stage that would have to land, in the Indian Ocean or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It'll have its own fuel, and yeah.
Right.
But the engineering challenge, the reason you're seeing them launch Starships from South Texas, that is the upper stage, what they're doing with that program. But the reason they're doing it is because they believe that is the much more difficult engineering piece. Like they think that, a rocket with 25 engines, we got this, because they're already flown the Falcon 9, they've flown the Falcon Heavy, and the basic flight profile of that is similar.
Right. But the rocket itself is it looks a lot different. The Falcon 9 kind of looks like a normal rocket.
Yeah.
The Starship,
the Starship Super Heavy stack is immense, to say the least. And
it used to be BFR, right?
Yep, it used to be BFR, and the origin of that name is is because Tom Muller, who was the original propulsion engineer, he was actually the first. So of the 5 people that Elon tried to hire as founding employees,
Right.
only Tom Muller and Chris Thompson, the structures guy, accepted. So they were the first 2 employees, and Muller was actually the first guy to sign on. Anyway, Muller built rocket engines as a hobbyist, as well as working for TRW, and he had a
Oh.
BFR. So that's the origin of that name is 20 years old too.
I did not know that. So you got to, as part of this Liftoff book that you wrote, you got to interview Elon, right?
Oh yeah,
Quite a bit.
I interviewed Elon. He invited me to come to the factory and sit in on their planning meetings. So like in his executive conference room, he would have about 15 or 20 engineers come in for Starship, for the Raptor rocket engine, for Starlink, for cargo, for Dragon, just to sort of see his management style.
Right.
And then I got to go with him down to Boca Chica and spend some time there as well.
So that's pretty cool to get to interview Elon. Did you smoke any weed?
No, we didn't smoke weed. Actually, what was interesting was I was supposed to interview him on a Friday night in LA. This was September a year and a half ago, and something came up. There was some kind of, his assistant was very apologetic. So I was sitting in the factory, and then I went back to my hotel in LA and was going to fly back to Houston. And then she called me that night and said, "Well, he's flying down to Brownsville tomorrow, and if you want to do the interview, if you want to go along with him, you can fly back to Texas and do the interview on the plane." So that's what I did, and so I'm sitting there on the plane with his bodyguards, and I see 2 Teslas come driving up, and one is him with 3 of his boys, and then the other one security's in the second one behind him, and he comes on the plane. He's got 3 of his sons; they were 13 at the time, and so it was kind of interesting to sort of see him as not Elon the international celebrity, not Elon the
Right.
space titan or disruptor of the automotive industry, but Elon the dad, because they brought along their dog,
Cool.
and sort of sitting around, shooting the shit with his kids and stuff, playing games with them. But it's interesting, like he is very much just a dad at
Right.
times.
Does he tell bad dad jokes?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if he ever told dad jokes, but he did want them to sit around and listen to the stories about the Falcon 1 days, because they were infants at the time.
Are the kids like impressed by space and stuff, or are they interested in basketball or who knows, video games or whatever?
I think I'm not sure that they were overly impressed with their dad. Like that, I'm not sure they realized their dad was Elon freaking Musk, right?
Right.
He was sort of dad.
I have a funny story. I was sitting on the couch watching the NBA with my daughter, probably 10 when LeBron started winning championships with the Heat, and we're sitting on the couch watching it, and she turned and looked at me and she said, "Dad, why can't you be more like LeBron James?"
Yep. They're never impressed.
They're not. No, they are not impressed about space or anything else. It just cracks me up. But that's what I think all kids are like that, right? Whatever your dad does, they're not impressed. They're impressed by the other dads.
Well, it's embarrassing actually for my daughter in middle school, who's very, very social, very very
Right.
outgoing. Unlike me, I'm pretty shy, pretty introverted. She's like my mother, or my wife, excuse me. And Space City Weather's core readership is basically moms, right?
Right.
People who are making decisions for their families, and they like the sort of the style of the site and the
Right.
approachability and so forth. So like all of her friends' mothers know me through the site, and that's just really embarrassing for her. And I take great pleasure from that. So
The key to good parenting is to be able to like shame your kids. You have to be able
yes,
to hold something over them.
that's right.
So that is awesome. You're a star here in Houston for sure, and so that would definitely be embarrassing for them. So Elon is probably the most iconic business leader, cultural figure, one of them for sure, in the world today. Everybody knows him.
I mean, with Tesla's price briefly going so high, he was at least for a little while, the world's richest person.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a measure of fame from that. And there's
Yeah.
just the fact that he is sort of so out there doing stuff in a very public way and trying to
Yeah.
brand Tesla and SpaceX. I mean, I agree. I mean, and he is, in my opinion, one of the very most interesting people in the world today because, he's out there trying to upend the automotive industry.
Right.
He's already
He
substantially
has.
disrupted. He
Yeah.
has, and
He has.
he's completely disrupted the space industry. I mean, NASA now has no more important contractor than SpaceX.
Right.
Um, and
Well, what's he done to Russia? Think of the Russian space program.
he's destroyed the Russian launch industry. Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, when China is trying to compete now in space, they're competing less with NASA than they are SpaceX in terms
Yeah.
of trying to copy their reuse and those kinds of things. And
Yeah.
so, and that, he's got other things going on too with AI and his tunneling company. And it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, super interesting
He's
and
definitely, yeah,
controversial for sure.
he is. So you mentioned something a little while ago that I want to, speaking of controversy, I want to dig down into. And this actually hasn't been controversial. Unfortunately, I think it should be. And that is Starlink.
Mm.
So can you explain, I think maybe a lot of the listeners haven't heard of that, or it's certainly not on the list of biggest threats to humanity, but just talk about Starlink, what it is, and if you think there's any problems with it.
Yeah. So there's about half a dozen companies in the United States and around the world that are thinking about or developing satellite-based internet. So, previously it really was not viable because the satellites were at geostationary orbit, which is thousands and thousands of miles above the surface of the Earth. And so there was, if you try to do internet from space, you'd have this long latency as even at the speed of light, the signal bounced down from Earth, back up and down. And so the solution to that is to have low Earth orbit satellite internet. And there's lots of problems with that because at geostationary space, the satellite is always at the same spot relative to the Earth as they rotate around. If you do it low Earth orbit, you need to have really sophisticated communication between satellites. You need to have a lot of them. And so, you've got SpaceX, but also Project Kuiper by Jeff Bezos and Intelsat and other companies are talking about putting hundreds or thousands of satellites up in low Earth orbit to create these networks so you could get high speed
Tens
internet.
of thousands. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And SpaceX is catching a lot of heat because they're proposing to put the most up, as you say, more than 10,000 satellites ultimately. And B, they're first. They've already launched more than 1,000 satellites. They're already, they're already providing service. So they're way ahead of these other companies. The second place company is OneWeb, and I think they've put up maybe 60 or 90, not all that many. And they had bankruptcies. They've kind of been slowed down.
Right.
So the idea is that instead of getting your internet from Comcast, right, you could just put a little thing on the side of your house and you could get internet from space, 24 hours a day, and it's continual and low latency, high speed. But the way they're selling this is it provides broadband internet to places like Alaska or remote areas
Africa,
where Comcast is not going to go in
right,
and spend billions of dollars to lay down the infrastructure to provide internet. And so already in places like Alaska and Canada, you can get Starlink today, and it's going to roll out wider across North America. It's controversial for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're putting up thousands of satellites ultimately, and that increases the collision risk. So you have a much higher chance of creating additional debris. These are already orbits, from about 400 to 1,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth that are pretty congested already. And so you have the potential.
What other satellites are there?
Well,
talk about just the basics of orbits.
I mean, already in low Earth orbit, you've got hundreds or thousands of Earth observation satellites, some communication satellites, although many of those are geostationary space we talked about earlier, much higher. But, NASA's got all these important, weather satellites in low Earth orbit, and the International Space Station is low Earth orbit. So, I mean, it is. Space is big,
right?
But as we put more stuff up there, I mean, I don't know, how many evasive maneuvers did you have to do on space station when you were there?
Well, I had a maneuver when I was commander because of the Chinese 2007 military anti-satellite. They decided that they would show the world that they could blow up a satellite, and they did. And the debris field is still there at the altitude of the space station. And every year we have to maneuver, once or twice. and it costs us millions of dollars in propellant to do that. And there's also the Russian. They had a satellite that died, and it ran into a Iridium, a sat phone satellite, and that created another cloud. So those are just two incidents. The Indians actually in 2019 decided that they wanted to join the club, and they blew up. Their military blew up a satellite in low Earth orbit. So this is a really bad idea. If there's any, military space chiefs watching the podcast, please stop blowing up satellites in low Earth orbit,
Yeah.
because the debris there, at the space station altitude, it'll be there for decades. At Hubble's altitude, it'll be there for centuries. Hubble's a little bit higher up. It's 300 miles instead of 200, whatever. And above 300 miles, if you're up at 500 or 1,000 miles, it's there forever. Like, that debris will never go away. And it's moving, 8 kilometers a second, 5 miles a second. So you're just taking a shotgun and the shells just keep on going, and they keep on going, the pellets, right? And so
yeah, as you put more and more satellites into these orbits, you increase the potential for collisions, which would create more debris, and you could eventually get a cascading effect. Another reason why it's controversial is these satellites initially, when they were launched, were pretty bright, and so people like dark skies, right? The astronomers love dark skies.
Right.
And just people like to walk out in their backyard and not see trains of bright lights going up. So ultimately, if there are thousands of these satellites in space, it's going to take away some of the natural beauty of the dark skies. And then finally, there is a concern or a thought that the real reason a lot of these companies are getting into developing these satellite systems are because if the US military had access to that kind of communications, that they're ultimately betting, I guess, that DoD would be willing to pay X billions of dollars a year to have this kind of communications wherever they deploy their people.
Yeah. No, if you had that system, it would be amazing. There's lots of things you could do for it. It's just a question is that cheaper than building fiber optic cable or having drones, solar powered drones that orbit in the atmosphere, right? There's other ways to get the internet out there. The problem with the satellites, though, that really concerns me is this idea of debris.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to a guy, he runs a company in England he got his PhD in space debris. And if you could deorbit every satellite when it was dead and have it burn up and drop in the Pacific Ocean, that would be fine. But these small, very inexpensive satellites are not going to work 100% of the time. Some percentage of them are just going to die and be stuck in orbit, in which case they might run into something and create the debris. And they're not going to deorbit them all the way to the ocean. You need to save a lot of gas in order to do that, and they don't have enough fuel propellant to do that. I think what I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, their plan is just to drop them down into kind of a low orbit where they would naturally, over 20 or 30 years, decay, which doesn't sound like that sounds like another way to create a lot of debris. I don't know if you know more about it than that.
They so far they have deorbited dozens of their satellites successfully. So I think SpaceX has a reasonably good plan to deal with, to sort of bring their satellites down low enough that they're captured in Earth's gravity and burn up in the atmosphere, over the course of months or years. And I think that's sort of, they're pretty consistent with whatever the standards are for that. I would also say that it is pretty darn impressive that they're able to put up so many satellites, and the service that they're providing now is good. Like, it's fast, it's reliable, and the customers that have it are generally pretty happy. Like during the pandemic, there were some school districts in Alaska that were able to do online school only because they had access to the Starlink internet service. And the technology to sort of do these interoperability links between the satellites to make sure you have continuous connection. I mean, it's just some pretty darn impressive engineering. And it's not just going, I would not hold SpaceX up as the bogeyman on this, because they're just first. There are other companies coming along that are going to do this. And even if the FCC were to say, no, we're concerned about debris, stop doing this, China's planning its own system. Europe's planning a system. Russia's looking at a system. So like, there will be other low Earth orbit broadband constellations coming in the next decade. And I think it is going to be a huge issue, because you're adding you're by a factor of 10 increasing the number of satellites in low Earth orbit,
Right.
and that's really problematic. And
Yeah.
I think bad things will happen, and we'll have to see what those are.
And my issue is when bad things happen, they're forever. You can't clean up space debris because each one of these little pieces is moving at 8 kilometers a second.
Yeah.
And I want to touch on something you said, Eric. You said SpaceX has a good plan to do this, which is great. But what the other part of what you said is there's no government agency requiring or regulating what SpaceX is doing. And you mentioned the FCC, but when you talk about airplanes and a engine cowling falls off of a 777, the FAA can say, hey, we're grounded. This is what you need to do. And, there's control over aviation, which is why it's so amazingly safe.
Yeah.
But there's not really a similar thing in space, right? Can you talk about that?
So the FCC, you have to get FCC permission to operate these constellations. And so
Federal Communications Commission, right? They worry about radio spectrum.
That's right. You have to get basically a spectrum license
Right.
through the FCC. Now they have been quite permissive. Like they don't really say no. They ask for changes and things like that. That's why it was a big deal a couple months ago when a company called AST and Space went out and had this plan to build these really big satellites. The FCC said, whoa, wait a minute. And NASA actually filed on their application in objection. But you're right. The regulations on these systems are there, but they're not particularly rigid.
Right.
And so it's kind of a wild, wild west.
Right. I mean, it's like the Commerce Department has something to do with it, and the FAA has something to do with it, and FCC has something to do with it. But
there is no debris agency in the United States, and the problem of orbital debris ought to be given to somebody, to some agency, whether it's the FAA or NASA or someone to sort of oversee in terms of making sure that what's going up is sustainable. And if there are problems, who has to clean it up? Because there are some companies, like there's a company called Astroscale that's doing some interesting thing. And so there are companies working in the space of trying to deorbit defunct satellites or deal with debris. But they're just very early on in their development.
If you could figure out how to do it, you could make lots of money for sure. Space servicing is becoming a big thing, right? Refueling satellites and
it is, but there's not a whole lot of a market for it yet, because the government agencies, like I said, if NASA or DoD or someone would put a price on sustainable orbits, then you would see more commercial activity, I think, in terms of trying to deal with the problem of debris. Yeah. But one of the biggest problems until now has not been satellites. It's been companies outside of the United States, because United Launch Alliance doesn't do this anymore, and SpaceX never really did. They would just send their second stages up there, and they wouldn't have the capacity to deorbit them. So they'd do a launch, and then the second stage would just be, floating around, as you say, in perpetuity.
Yeah. And that brings it back to, if we had a space FAA, I think we need an organization that's essentially a space FAA, but that's only America. There's also China and Russia and Europe and everybody else. So the FAA has ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and that's why we can fly to Europe and Beijing and Moscow, and everybody has the same standards, and it's safe most places. I think we need something like that too, because it's really an international problem. In space, it doesn't care if it's a Chinese or Russian or American satellite. If you hit another satellite, you're going to explode and make 1,000 pieces of debris. I think that international part is really important.
Yeah, and I don't see anything really on the horizon that will address that. Now, NASA introduced this concept called the Artemis Accords last year.
Yeah,
which was basically, well, it was an idea that if as we go out and explore, go back to the moon and explore further with people, there ought to be some shared values, like scientific data ought to be shared publicly. You shouldn't be claiming large swaths of territory on the moon. You ought to follow best practices. And as part of that, you could have some norms about satellite launches and deorbiting second stages and things like that. The problem is that it's going to be very difficult to get international agreement on the Artemis Accords. Already like about 10 nations have signed on, like Italy and Australia and places like that. But Russia, the head of the Russian space program, Dmitry Rogozin, has said that this is an American trying to control the world, and they're not into it, and China hasn't made any comments about it. And so if you don't have any kind of international program that brings China and Russia along with you, then it's not good. And there's no agency really that's doing that.
Yeah, I think the State Department needs to do so. The Artemis Accords were important, and I think a lot of folks had not heard about it. But one of the problems is it's almost a bilateral deal. It's like kind of like, well, UAE signed on, which was actually really cool. They just launched the first Arab probe to Mars, but like we'll do a deal with the UAE and they agree, or with Canada or whatever. But
the basic right now is if you want to be part of the Artemis program. So the Artemis program was created by the Trump administration, and whatever your politics are, that actually was really popular in the space community and internationally. It was basically a plan led by NASA, but with international participation to go back to the moon and then eventually to Mars, although I think that's quite a bit ways in the future. And basically, if you want to participate in that, you have to sign on to these Artemis Accords. And Russia probably wasn't going to participate in it anyway, and China definitely wasn't. So, that kind of framework is not going to be something that encompasses the entire world. And unfortunately, there's nothing really at the United Nations that does that either.
Right. The UN does have I think is their space agency, not agency, but office, I think is in Vienna, but it's not very active or whatever. So I want to talk about Russia and China because I'm conflicted on this, and I've written about it and I speak about it, and it's a big deal to me. I think the most valuable contribution that the ISS has had, the International Space Station, has been in our cooperation internationally, especially with Russia. It's been a pretty bad decade between the West and Russia, except in space. The ISS has been the one bright spot. And so having that engagement with the Russians has been good. I love Russia. I love Russian language. I love visiting there. I love the people. I wish my Russian crewmate happy birthday this weekend. I made a movie with another Russian crewmate. I'm a big fan of Russians and the people and the culture. But the government kills journalists and poisons political opposition and sends arms to all the bad guys on the planet, right? There's real problems with the Russian government. And so I'm conflicted. Is that a good partner, to have a partner that kills people? I mean, if you're there as an astronaut, are you safe for training? But then on the other hand, if you don't have that engagement, does that lead to more conflict on Earth? So that's something I'm conflicted about. And China's even more so, right? So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So I'm with you. I mean, I love the history of the Russian space program. I've got my Yuri Gagarin
I see it.
T-shirt on. So the fact of the matter is, when you're talking about a human exploration program beyond low Earth orbit, the Russian space program doesn't really bring much to the table. They don't have much in the way of funding. And their technology really is geared toward low Earth orbit. They've never sent humans beyond low Earth orbit. None of their rockets are really capable of delivering the kinds of material you would need to the moon. They don't have any deep space spacecraft. They talk a lot about developing these technologies, but they haven't really invested in actually doing it.
Right.
So if you were to bring them along in Artemis, it would need to be for geopolitical reasons, right? You would rather have the Russians working with the United States than China in space, for example, which I think ultimately, if Russia isn't part of the Artemis program, they will start working with China.
Yeah, we're pushing them towards China for sure.
We're pushing them towards China, and I'm like you. I'm even more uncomfortable with China. On the one hand, I celebrate sort of the fact that there's another major space power. What they did in returning rocks from the surface of the moon a couple of months ago, that was a remarkable feat. Only the United States and the Soviet Union had done that.
And the far side of the moon, right? Chang'e 5.
And the year before that, they landed on the far side of the moon, something that no one had done. And in June, they're going to try to land the Tian-1 spacecraft on the surface of Mars. And no one has ever done that but NASA. So if they succeed in putting that lander down, and then there's a small rover, that would be a phenomenal achievement as well. And so China is doing really interesting things in space, but their space program, they don't really have a civil space program. It's all part of their military.
Right.
And they don't really show their activities in real time often. So like you only find out about launches after the fact, or
Like
if
the
you know,
Soviet Union. Right.
right, or if you only know, or if you find the right social media pages, you can maybe watch stuff as it happens. They're not really good about that. They're not particularly transparent.
Right.
They have shared some of their lunar data from the Chang'e program, which is good. But you know, they're doing lots of human rights abuses as well with the Uyghurs. And
With Hong Kong.
with Hong Kong. Yeah, exactly. Right. So and oh, by the way, NASA is prohibited from working with the Chinese space program by the US Congress, which is worried about technology transfer. They're thinking that if Chinese work with the International Space Station, they would steal secrets, technology. And maybe they would.
Right.
I don't know. But I mean, there's certainly some of those concerns are valid. So Russia, I don't think it's too late yet to sort of work with them and bring them back into the fold. China is still a much longer term project. Now, where I do see a little bit of hope is if NASA really does get serious about going to Mars, and we're not serious about it now and never really have been.
Mm-hmm.
But if there was geopolitical support for going to Mars, an international Mars mission that had a Russian, Chinese, and a US and a European astronaut and someone from Africa, I mean, you're talking about something that really could be this beacon of hope to the world that could show, look, humanity's working together on this massive, expensive, technologically challenging project, and we're all doing it so we can set foot on another world, like another planet for the first time. And I think that is the kind of thing that might, space could bring things together back here on Earth, as you say, down on Earth, down to Earth. But
Down to Earth, yeah, that's the name of the show.
I think that may be a little optimistic. That's sort of me hoping for that to happen.
I think if we sent a Chinese and an American astronaut to Mars, that's not going to change the Chinese Communist Party's view on democracy and free speech and the freedom to peaceably petition the government for a redress of grievances is just not going to happen. And so for me, I'm really conflicted on that because I love China. In 2018, I went there 5 times, did a lot of speaking there. My son is crazy enough. He went to the Wuhan Medical School for a summer exchange 6 months before the pandemic hit. And so I have a foundation in China, a lot of friends there. And one of them was just arrested without cause, disappeared from Earth. She was a business reporter for CGTN, which is their big network. So she was Eric. She was a journalist, and she's Chinese, but she's an Australian citizen. So as part of this feud they have going on, they just arrested her, cleaned her from existence, like in 1984. So it kind of hit home for me how these authoritarian countries can operate. And so I don't know. I think it's a discussion. We can't solve it now, but it's something that we need to kind of think out loud because, America should be promoting democracy and freedom and free market economies, that kind of thing. And space can be a great way to have a positive relationship when things are not going well on Earth, but there's also a limit to that. So anyway, I think it's an important discussion point.
I do too. And I mean, you go back to the days of Apollo when we did go to the moon in the 1960s, and the purpose of that program really was to show the rest of the world that a democracy was a better form of government or a more efficient form of government than communism. And that was what the space race was all about in that era. And so maybe we get into a second space race, that kind of thing. But I don't know. I mean,
it's different now.
It's totally different now. Yeah. Like I'm not sure people today would be all that impressed if we went back to the moon, right? Does the world care as much about that today?
It's not the same, yeah. And people are kind of young people grow up where that's normal. I mean, we
Yeah.
do go to the moon and Jupiter and Pluto and Mars, and we see galaxies and all that stuff's normal. In the 60s, it wasn't normal. It was like we were really groundbreaking. So yeah, I don't think we should form our space program around the 60s paradigm. I'm glad we did it. It's what inspired me to be an astronaut. I mean, the Apollo was the most amazing thing of all time, but it's not the 60s anymore. So, there's still good reasons to go explore space, and I'm a big fan. In fact, I want to talk about that. So this has been awesome just talking about what's going on in space, but there's we had big news this week, right? We're about to have big news in less than an hour, I think. We're filming this on Perseverance press conference day.
Right. So yeah, last week, obviously, the Mars Perseverance spacecraft successfully landed on Mars, and the landing profile, it had the 7 minutes of terror, like Curiosity did back in August of 2012. But this time around, they had much better cameras actually on the descent stage
Yeah.
and the rover itself. And so we're expecting NASA to release some or all of this landing sequence video, which should be really dramatic, because we've never seen a spacecraft, what it's actually like for a spacecraft to come down through the thin Martian atmosphere and try to sit down on the red planet. So very exciting to see that. You know, there's the iconic pictures of like the footprint on the moon,
Right.
you know, the salute and the lunar module in the background, and Earthrise. And I think that seeing this landing video could be another moment like that, of sort of showing the people on Earth what space exploration, how inspiring space exploration can be. And I think I'm looking forward to seeing that, because I think it will be both dramatic and inspiring to see that.
I think what JPL does is, I think they're the highlight of NASA. NASA does a lot of cool stuff, but JPL is a Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It's out in California, and they do a lot of the unmanned exploration. So the Mars rovers and probes to Jupiter and Pluto and stuff is done there. And those guys are just amazing. They had a blip about 20 years ago. They got they got English and metric mixed up on the Mars Polar lander, and it became the Mars Polar Impactor. And ever since then, they've been crushing it. They've probably the smartest people in America, I think, are at NASA JPL.
Yeah, they have had a tremendous run at Mars.
Yeah.
When no other, I mean, the Soviet Union's
It's
tried
amazing.
to land on Mars like 6 times, and the longest anything ever lasted was 20 seconds. And Europeans have tried a couple times, and just no one has ever soft landed something on Mars like
It's
NASA
tough.
has.
Yeah, and the Perseverance, we'll talk about how it lands. It's not like a parachute, or it's not like the moon rover. The 7 minutes of terror is EDL, entry, descent, and landing. So that's how you get to the surface of Mars. So can you just explain in the elevator pitch how that works?
Yeah, so you've got to, it's more difficult on Mars because there's much less atmosphere to use for braking than there is on Earth.
Right.
And so you've got, and as NASA has built progressively larger rovers, the Perseverance rover is a little more than 1 ton, its mass. And so they had to create a system that's rather complex to get this down. And so
how fast is it going?
It hits the atmosphere. Oh, you put me on the spot, Terry. I don't know.
Something like 20,000.
Yeah, 20,000 kilometers a second, something like that. It's many times the speed of sound.
Yeah.
And or 20,000 kilometers an hour, excuse me.
Yeah.
it hits the atmosphere, and then it slows down through the atmosphere, and then parachutes come out, and then it falls down, I think, to about 4 kilometers above the surface. And it's this, and the cool thing about Perseverance is it had this new camera system looking down at the surface, because when Curiosity landed in 2012, they purposely picked a very flat area with no boulders, you know, with what they thought would be smooth area, so that there was this like 40 kilometers across where you could make a landing and would be safe, right? Because they were most concerned about getting it down on the ground safely.
Right.
This time they wanted to land near scientists believe is an ancient river delta. So it's much more up and down, more rocks, so forth. So they had a landing area not 40 kilometers across, but about 4 kilometers across. And so they had this terrain relative navigation system that was basically, as it got to about 4 kilometers, it started taking pictures, like low resolution photos, trying to map exactly where it was relative to satellite imagery of Mars. And then as it got further and it sort of was confident where it was, it would take high resolution imagery so that it could find all of the little threats or hazards and avoid those, and then sort of pinpoint the area. So the parachute, so as it's falling under parachutes, it's taking all these pictures, and then this descent stage comes out, and it's got little rockets that it's using to sort of bring it down, and then it releases a sky crane which sort of sets the rover down and then
Right.
flies away so that it doesn't, doesn't cause
Land on
dust,
it.
doesn't land on it or cause dust around it. So it's really a really complicated but very um, wonderful engineering solution to a very difficult problem.
It's amazing. Do you remember? So when I was a kid, Viking happened, and that was a really cool thing. But it wasn't a rover; it was just a lander, and
Yeah.
it had, I think it was nuclear powered. I think there was like a plutonium. They call them RTGs. A bar of plutonium the size of my drink here, and it would just get warm, and it used the warmth for electricity, and it lasted for decades. I think Viking
Yeah.
was. I used to have pictures from Viking. My stepdad would bring him home from work. He was an engineer, and they were on my wall. But now they're so much more advanced. The Sojourner, I think, was 96. It was like our first rover, and it was a little mini rover that you could buy at the toy store
Yeah.
if they had toy stores anymore. And it was like an airbag. It blew up in this big airbag and just bounced for a while. And I think we did that a couple times, but we've advanced to this. The sky crane thing is amazing.
Yeah, the next step is really going to have to be a full-on propulsive landing system. So
Like we landed on the moon. Yeah.
like you land on the moon, and that's what, when you look at what SpaceX is doing with Starship, that is a propulsive landing. You would
Right.
fire the engines as it came through the Martian atmosphere, slow down, and try to touch down.
Right.
And as you get much bigger than a payload of about a ton, that's what you need to move to. And we've never done that on Mars, so it's a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's weird. There's two ways to slow down, right? You can use the air to slow you down and just friction, or you can use a rocket. And so you either have a heat shield or you have propellant, and which one's heavier, which one is more efficient. But at Mars, you need both because there's a little bit of an air, but it's not really that much. So anyway, it's a really cool problem, and I'm glad we got some smart people out of JPL doing this. I can't wait to see what they say at the press conference today.
One of the cool things that SpaceX did when they were testing out propulsive landing for their Falcon 9s here on Earth, right? The ones that land on the boat or the landing site, is there's a point up in the Earth atmosphere, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure exactly the altitude, but where it's basically the thickness of the atmosphere is the same as it is near the surface of Mars. So they've practiced lighting the engines at that altitude to sort of simulate what a burn would be like on the surface of Mars to get that
Right.
data for when ultimately they would be trying to set down on the surface of Mars.
Cool. That's
So
interesting.
they're thinking about that. Even 5 years ago, they were thinking about that.
Using that upper atmosphere as a Mars test facility.
Yeah.
There's so many cool things about Mars. It's so much more interesting than the moon. It has twice the gravity that the moon does. It's still like 3/8 of Earth, so it's less than half Earth gravity, but it's closer. It's got a 24 and a half hour day, so it's close to what we have. It'd be kind of nice to have an extra 30 minutes every day.
That'd be great.
You think that, but my friends who are on the Mars science team, they're like, it's cool for the first few days, but then after a week or two, it just wipes you out. If you try and shift your human body to Mars time, our bodies are not made for 24 and a half hour days. Anyway, it has an atmosphere. It has water. If you got a telescope, you can look in your backyard and look at the polar ice caps, and there's frozen water in there.
Has methane.
But yeah, so right, and there's CO2. There's the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, and it's only like 1% of Earth. It's not. If you open your visor on the moon, you would die instantly. If you open your visor on Mars, you would die 1 or 2 seconds later. It's not habitable at all. But there's one big problem with Mars, and Elon wants to go habitate or colonize Mars, I guess, inhabit Mars, but there's no magnetic field. Right. And so that's why it doesn't have an atmosphere, we think, right?
Right. The thinking is that billions of years ago, the solar wind stripped away the atmosphere because of the absence of a magnetic field.
Right.
And I'm not I'm not up on the geology of Mars enough to know why it lost its
Right.
magnetic field or why it never had one. But yeah, that's a major problem, and the atmosphere is actually getting thinner every year as a result of that.
Yeah. Because the solar wind just like strips it away.
Yeah, and there's other problems too. I mean, it's the closest planet to some extent, but it's still 6 months away at least to get there, and so it's very far. It's very cold.
Yeah. It's like
There's lots of
Houston.
reasons. That's right. Mars was warmer than Houston last week. So
Mars was warmer than Houston last week. That is insane. So was Moscow. So was, Boston. So was a lot of places.
Alaska. Yeah.
So the challenges for there, from my perspective, of all the things that we need, I think nuclear power is the most important because you can have solar power for really low power things, but you need to have batteries. And there's it's a Earth day, so 12 hours sunlight, 12 hours nighttime. You're going to have a lot of batteries to store up the power, and people require a lot of electricity, as we found out in Houston last week. And so you need some type of nuclear power, I think, on the ground that would do kilowatts. And if you could make megawatts of nuclear power, you can use electric propulsion, a different type of rocket engine that can get you there in 2 or 3 months instead of 6 to 9 months. And what that enables is you can get to Mars and back in 1 year instead of taking the 3-year boat. I think you and I have had this talk many times, but from my perspective, that's a really important technology. And going back to our political discussion about international partners, that would be the nuclear propulsion aspect of things would be a great project for a country that doesn't have 2-year election cycles and American politics to deal with. That might be a good.
It is interesting because in just the last couple of years, we've seen some real steps toward that. DOE is working with NASA to develop an in-space nuclear power plant that you could deploy on the surface of the moon or Mars for power.
Right.
And so that's significant. And then just last week, the National Academies published a report basically looking at nuclear thermal propulsion, which is like a conventional rocket engine, but using nuclear energy to heat up the hydrogen, or nuclear electric propulsion, which is what you talked about going faster. Right. They concluded that nuclear thermal propulsion was probably closer, a more near-term development.
Right.
And the idea there is you could get to Mars with about a third of the propellant that a chemical mission would take. And so that would cut down on the mass needs for your mission, which is mostly propellant anyway.
Right.
So and the recommendation of that National Academies report was that if you wanted to send a human mission to Mars in the 2030s, you would almost certainly need nuclear propulsion. And if you wanted to do it, you have to get started right about now to fly test missions next decade.
I've been saying that for years. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So chemical rockets are rockets that everybody knows about. You take a fuel, you take oxygen, you burn them, and you shoot the gas out the back end of the rocket. And this Russian guy, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, right, came up with the rocket equation. Yeah. And 100 years ago, he figured out the rocket equation. And it basically says how fast your rocket can go is related to how fast you shoot the propellant out the back. So the most efficient chemical rockets on Earth are limited. They can only shoot propellant so fast. If you use electric propulsion, where your propellant has an electrical charge, so you have an electrical field, and we all learned in high school science class, negative repels negative, and so you can shoot the propellant out just using an electrical charge. You can go a lot faster. It doesn't make a lot of thrust. There's not a lot of force, but it's 24/7. The chemical engine only burns for a few minutes, but this electric propulsion will burn for months. And a lot of satellites in Earth orbit use electric propulsion, really small thrust. They use them to kind of maintain their orbit for station keeping. And so if you scale that up, you need to scale it up a lot, is an understatement. But then that's when you can get to Mars really fast. In order to get enough electricity, you can't use solar. The solar panels would have to be, the size of a city. Yeah. So you need nuclear power just to make the electricity. So that type of nuclear propulsion is using the nuclear power for electricity. And a totally different type of electric or propulsion that you were talking about is nuclear thermal, where you use the nuclear material, plutonium or uranium or whatever. It is hot. It just is hot because it's nuclear. And you warm up the propellant and you shoot it out after you just warm up hydrogen or xenon or whatever the propellant is. So those are kind of three basic different types. But the nuclear thermal, do you know off the top of your head? I've read this. I forgot. How fast is it to Mars compared to the other types?
It's not a whole lot faster than chemical. The primary
Right.
advantage of that, and frankly of nuclear electric in the near term, is you just need less propellant because you
Right.
don't.
So it saves money.
It saves money. It saves money. Yeah, and yeah. And the thing is, if you look at so you can launch to Mars approximately every 26 months. There's a conjunction that's favorable. Some of those conjunctions for commercial or for conventional chemical propulsion, you need like 1,000 tons or 1,200 tons of propellant to make it happen. Some of them you need like 3,000. So like if you had an architecture that worked for a 2033 mission to Mars, like you may need like twice as much propellant to make that happen in 2035. The nice thing about using the nuclear thermal propulsion is that it's more or less the same. So it's much more predictable.
Right. And launch cost comes down. And when you look at launch costs to Mars, that's going to be a big number. And we're borrowing this year, $4 or $5 trillion more than we had planned. And there's just not going to be a lot of spare cash laying around, I don't think, anyway, for NASA's budget for coming decades. So whatever we can do to lower costs, that's not a nice to have, I don't think. That's like, it's not going to happen unless we can bring the cost down.
I think the Artemis moon program is kind of right at the bleeding edge of NASA's budget capabilities presently.
Well, they just had much less appropriated, right, than they had hoped for. For the lander, basically didn't get funded.
The lander got about 800 million, and they wanted more than 3 million for the lander to keep on track for a 2024 landing. Sorry, 3 billion to keep on track for a 2024 landing. That's going to slip now to 2026 or 2028. That's not anyone's fault, really. But there are, it was notable to me that both Congress and the Biden administration have signaled their support for Artemis. So I think this could be the first time since the Apollo program that you see a human exploration program designed for beyond low Earth orbit travel carry over from one administration to the next. So I think that's significant.
Who's going to be the next NASA administrator?
Great question. We may find out in the next few weeks. I've heard names, but I don't want to throw anyone out there. But it's very much under it's very much under consideration.
Are the initials EB?
No, initials are not
based in Houston.
No. So I have too many enemies.
Amen, brother. Hey, so launch gets all the hype, right? Or going to the moon and Mars. But there's other aspects of space business. I did this panel a few years ago at Goldman Sachs about the space industry. And it was really amazing. The lady that I was with, Clarissa, was a consultant. She was probably the smartest person I've ever talked to about space. But it was interesting to see in this big space economy pie, there's telecommunications, which is 9/10 of the pie. And then there's military, which is the other 10th of the pie. And then NASA's like this really small amount. And then there's even smaller amounts. But I just want to talk about the different aspects of space business. What do you think's interesting? Is there going to be, well, we talked about Starlink already. That's probably one of the biggest. There's sensors, different cameras, hyperspectral imaging you can do. Manufacturing, do you think space manufacturing is going to happen? Do you think space mining is going to happen? But when it comes to space business, what's interesting to you?
So, if we want to see humans expand out beyond Earth, there needs to really be an economic incentive for that to happen. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the, past explorations by humans of this planet, a lot of them were driven for economic reasons. The main customer for a lot of things in space still today is the government, right? If you're IBM, there's no reason for you to go to space to try to make money, because what are the resources in low Earth orbit are microgravity in a vacuum. And you
Mhm.
get there's more resources on the moon, there's more on Mars, but it's just not economically feasible to do that. So you're right. The primary way people are making money now in space today are, number one, telecommunications. So, satellite TV, communications, things like that. And then secondarily is remote sensing. So Earth
Mhm.
observation is a growing market. But beyond that, the business case uses for space are really small.
Mhm.
So I don't think we get to a point where we're really out there in space until we find killer applications for economic development in space. Otherwise, we're stuck mostly with government space programs, which move
Right.
slowly and aren't as nimble as the private sector, evidenced by SpaceX and other companies. So we'll see. I mean, if you could find some kind of killer application for manufacturing something in microgravity, protein crystals, or something for health, or some kind of fine fiber optic wire. There's lots of ideas, and that's one of the great things about the International Space Station, is that for the last decade or so, it has served as a test bed for some of these ideas to see if A, they work, and then B, if something is scalable in terms of manufacturing. So I'm optimistic that we'll find those killer applications over the next decade, but I couldn't sit here and predict what they'll be.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the one nice thing about low cost launch is that if it's cheaper to get stuff up into space and try it, then you're going to get more companies and small businesses trying things.
I'm working with a company right now. I'm super excited. These guys are all SpaceX alum, which is one of the great things that SpaceX is doing. Not only is it making rockets, but it's also mentoring and developing a generation of engineers. And if you go to SpaceX, you're probably an entrepreneurial kind of guy. So a lot of men and women are getting trained, and hopefully they'll diffuse out into the economy and do great things in other industries. But these guys have a plan to do space manufacturing that I'm super excited about, and that's kind of the holy grail. The ISS is great for testing and science projects, but it's not a manufacturing facility. So
Sure. Yeah.
I'm super excited about that. But it's space is a great place. I do guest lecturing at Harvard Business School, and they have like an aerospace club there for the MBAs that want to go in the aerospace industry. And they asked me to talk, so I said, one of my talks there, I said, "Do you guys want to know how to become a millionaire in the space industry?" And their perk up. I'm like, "Well, you start out as a billionaire." So there's a lot of ways. It's kind of like owning a boat. There's a lot of ways to spend a lot of money in space, but I do
Mm.
think some of them are going to be very profitable. So speaking about spending a lot of money in space, what do you think about Blue Origin? Your book Liftoff is about SpaceX, but now you need one about Blue for your next book.
Um, so Blue Origin has been really disappointing because back in 2016, it seemed like they were really on the cusp of taking off. They were
Mhm.
going to start launching humans on their New Shepard system within a couple of years. And they still haven't done that yet, 5 years later, although that may happen later this year. Um, they were, they were finishing up this BE-4 rocket engine that they were
Mhm.
going to sell and use on their own rocket, New Glenn. And they're starting to build talking about a lunar lander called Blue Moon. And since then, they've moved really slowly and acted more like a traditional space company, kind of looking for government contracts than just sort
Mhm.
of out there innovating. And they
They
just
built the headquarters in Alabama,
they
right?
built a big manufacturing facility in
Right.
Alabama to cater to that the
The
Alabama
senator from
mafia in
Alabama.
space, the
Mhm.
senator and the representatives who hold influential positions in Congress. So that's not good. However, Jeff Bezos recently announced that he was retiring from Amazon, and his true passion really is space. And so he is going to be spending more time at Blue Origin. I'm told he's very energized about that. And I think him coming to Blue Origin more will push that company to move faster and to do sort of more innovative things. So I would expect, while it has been a pretty plodding 5 years by Blue Origin, I think we're going to start to see things from them that are pretty impressive. But
So you mentioned,
it's
yeah.
I was just going to say it's a really interesting contrast between Musk and Bezos, is because Musk has a lot of things going on too, but there is no doubt that he is there every day pushing his teams forward as fast as they possibly will go. It's been that way since day one at SpaceX. It's just this constant pressure from Musk to move forward at the greatest possible speed, like he's running out of time. And it makes for a very difficult work environment, right? You compare the work environment at SpaceX versus Blue Origin, one is a lot more difficult than the other, but at SpaceX, you're doing a lot more stuff.
Yeah, but Blue Origin, so part of this is Elon is not shy about going on podcasts and tweeting, and he's very much the extrovert, and Jeff Bezos is, I don't know if he's an introvert personally, but he's not that guy. But they're doing big things. They built the facility in Alabama, which is the big NASA center for rockets. And you've seen their building at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, right? I think it's the world's biggest building. It is massive. The Blue Origin, if you've ever been to the Kennedy Space Center, for the viewers, and you see the big VAB where the Saturn V and the space shuttle was built, Blue Origin has a building like that, only I think it's bigger. It's huge. So they have plans, and Jeff Bezos has some spare cash that he can fund his company with. And that BE-4 engine. So I was in space, a lot of sanctions and Crimea and Ukraine, a lot of bad stuff with Russia and the US. Yeah. And Mr. Rogozin, who you mentioned earlier, the deputy prime minister, he's in charge of the space program. He called us, or he tweeted, "Hey, Americans, you can take a trampoline to get to the space station," threatening that we couldn't use the Soyuz anymore because they didn't like sanctions. And when he did that, I kind of winced. I was like, ugh. And so in the ensuing years, Congress has spent a lot of money to build rocket engines, because going back to the 90s, part of the deal was we wanted to help the Soviet Union transition to a normal life. So we agreed to buy their rocket engines, and they have good rocket engines. They're cheap. All of the military rockets that we launch on the Atlas are on Russian military rocket engines. So the spy satellites that we launched to spy on Russia are launched by Russian rockets. It's like one of the great ironies of of the modern times. And after he threatened that, Congress went, "Hey, I wonder if we should be depending on Russian rocket engines." And so as part of this big rocket competition over the last few years, the BE-4 engine is a really I was thinking that it was going to be the rocket engine of the 21st century, but that's a big thing going on at Blue Origin, just to give the listeners some context on what we're talking about there. And what is that going to power? What rockets are going to use the BE-4? It won't only be Blue Origin rockets, right?
Right. So the company you mentioned, United Launch Alliance, which built the Atlas rocket, which had use the RD-180 Russian engine,
right,
was told it had to transition to an American-made engine, and so they had a competition in the 2014 and 2015, 2016, and ultimately decided to go with Blue Origin's BE-4 engine over another American-made engine by Aerojet. It was they were concerned about the price of the Aerojet engines, and so the Vulcan rocket, which is their Atlas replacement, is supposed to fly this year, although I'm skeptical. I think it will get delayed into next year for its first launch. But that rocket will use the BE-4 engine. Then Blue Origin is developing its New Glenn rocket, which is this massive rocket, supposed to be reusable like the Falcon 9. We'll use 7 of the BE-4 engines.
That's the New Glenn?
New Glenn, yeah.
And so New Shepard is a small space tourist rocket. It just goes up and comes down.
Suborbital, yeah.
Suborbital, which Alan Shepard, the first American in space, was on a suborbital flight. And then Blue Origin has the New Glenn, which is going to be an orbital rocket like a Falcon 9. And that's like John Glenn was the first American in orbit. And then New Armstrong is their BFR. That's their big rocket for the future. And of course, Neil Armstrong went to the moon. So I think that's the naming. That's the way Blue Origin names their rockets, right?
Yeah, that's right. And New Armstrong, I think, is years and years and years into the future. Right. They're struggling enough to get New Glenn, which I'd be surprised if that launches before 2023. But really? to go back and sort of, to go back and sort of put a finer point on the pace at which these companies are moving. So let's go back to 2016. 2016 was the first year or in December of 2015, Blue Origin landed New Shepard successfully for the first time. And then a couple months later, in December of that year, SpaceX landed the Falcon 9 rocket for the first time. So in the 5 years since then, right, Blue Origin has launched New Shepard about 12 more times. They haven't flown anything else
Right.
at all. SpaceX in that time has flown almost 100 rockets. They're now the world's largest satellite operator. They launched and developed the Falcon Heavy rocket. They developed the Crew Dragon spacecraft to become the only company in the world to be able to launch humans into orbit. And they've flown that twice now with people on board, and will again soon later this spring. They've developed the Cargo Dragon spacecraft. They've launched their Starship prototype 4 times now, and are about to launch it a 5th time, probably later this week.
Blew it up 3 or 4 times too, right?
Blew it up many times with this expansive development program. And so, I mean, that is an incredible resume of achievements. Like,
it is.
So Blue Origin is, it's they have the potential to be really revolutionary, but so far they've just moved slowly.
Yeah. That is an amazing summary, Eric. When you lay all that out, it's amazing how much SpaceX has done.
And I completely forgot to say they've entirely proved out the economics of reuse, because they've not only landed their rockets, they've flown the same one 7-8 times and done it and gotten permission now from DoD to launch spy satellites on flown rockets, and from NASA to fly people on previously flown rockets. I mean, it's crazy.
It's insane what SpaceX has done. They have they've definitely, and they're, I think, going to be going public, right? It's a privately held company.
No, they're never going to go public, I don't think, or not until they're
think?
on Mars. Elon and Gwen Shotwell have talked about taking Starlink public.
Okay, I've heard about SpaceX.
The internet service, yeah.
I talked to Elon years ago when I was at NASA, and he said being public is like standing in your house and having your crazy neighbor at the end of your driveway just yelling out how much he thinks your house is worth. He said because Tesla is public, and
that's right. Yeah.
Lucky for him, the price is insane. It may be a bubble. I don't know. But that there's definitely advantages to staying private and not having to deal with all the harassment that comes with going public.
Yeah, and it's not like he's had trouble raising money for SpaceX. I mean,
right.
Every time they do a new round of funding, the valuation goes up. So
right. You can raise money if you're private. It's just not in the market. You can't buy and sell the shares as easily as if it's on the New York Stock Exchange.
So between funding from NASA, DoD, private fundraisers, and then his own increasingly personal wealth, I used to have doubts that SpaceX could fund the Starship program, because what they're trying to do with that is so ambitious. But I don't doubt it anymore. I mean, he has, even with his own personal wealth, he could bankroll that.
Right.
But
well, the market bubble helps.
Yeah.
That crazy stock prices. What do you think the ISS future is going to be? What do you think is going to replace it, or if anything? Is it going to, and how long will it stay in orbit?
Well, I think it flies for another decade, or at least to 2030. There just is political will, certainly from this administration. The Biden administration wants to keep it flying.
Right.
Congress wants to keep it flying, and so it's going to keep going. Will a viable private company step in to fly private modules? I mean, Axiom Space in Houston is doing some things, but I think that they're going to need a lot more funding than they've got to realize that. Bigelow has essentially gone bankrupt, so they're not in the game. There's a company called Nanoracks that could play in this space. But I just have a hard time seeing there being a commercial market for a low Earth orbit space station if NASA, is not the private customer, or it's not the prime customer.
Right. It has to. There's a lot of subsidies that go into that.
Exactly.
ISS can make a little bit of money, but not even a dent into the total cost of operating it. That's It's an international part. It's like a treaty. Private companies can't really make treaties.
So if I had to guess, I would say the ultimate solution is that NASA does a fixed price contract for a commercial space station development by 2030 or something like that. That probably that's where that's headed.
For a different space station.
For an ISS replacement, smaller,
yeah,
commercial to some extent, but NASA's still paying for most of it.
Right. There's so much stuff to talk about, Eric. We haven't even talked about the moon and Artemis and Gateway and all that stuff. What other stuff do you want to talk about? Like space or not space, politics, or are the Astros going to World Series this year?
No, I would just say that no offense to the space shuttle program, because you're obviously a huge fan of that, and it's a hell of a ride. And the space shuttle did some amazing things. But when I was a reporter in the 2000s covering space, it was fairly dull, right? I mean, you'd have shuttle missions go up, and it was all so well choreographed. It was hard, right? It was super difficult, but it sure looked easy from the outside.
Yeah.
Like you guys knew how to do it. And there wasn't as much commercial activity. Today, between NASA's Artemis program, all the interplanetary probes, and all of the activity both in the commercial sector in the United States and around the world, this is the most exciting time to be following space, I think, ever, even since the Apollo days. Just because there's so much activity, there's something going on almost every day that's exciting or new or with the potential to explode. And there's just so much potential, in terms of both going back to the moon and all these other areas. So I just think it's a wonderful time to be following this industry.
Yeah, it's amazing. Plus, back in the 20 years ago, none of the CEOs were smoking weed on TV.
Certainly having the personalities like, Musk and Bezos is going to be more front and center going forward.
He has a personality. It's just different than Musk's, but he has a personality.
He has a personality. He's no less brilliant. And he's no less determined, right, than Musk. It's just up until now, he's been determined to dominate the US or global retail industry. And now he's going to turn his attention to space.
Well, now that he's done that.
Now that he's done that, right?
Yeah.
So that will be an interesting dynamic to watch.
The Musk Bezos race, that's the space race. It's not US Russia, it's not US China, it's Musk and Bezos, I think, anyway. And I think it's better than the Kardashians.
I think it's Elon and Jeff, and believe me, Jeff is not happy about playing second fiddle to Elon. And it's also the US commercial sector versus China, I think.
In China, yeah. So maybe it's a three-way race: China, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos. My crewmate from, his name is signed on there, from STS 130. Nick Patrick works at Blue Origin. He's one of their mission directors, and he's like one of the key players there. And he gave me a tour up in Washington. So Blue Origin is based in Washington State near Seattle. But they have facilities at the launch places, and SpaceX is in Southern California and Los Angeles. Anyway, it's an amazing facility. They have amazing people. It's completely secret. They're not, doing things publicly. And at the time, this is probably 2 years ago, Jeff was spending, I think Wednesday, he spent a day a week at Blue Origin, which is a lot for the world's one of the most important guys. So space, like you said, space is his passion. I think maybe when he gives up the reins to Amazon, that'll free up some time and he can light some fires.
Yeah, I visited in 2016. Same kind of thing. It was super impressive, right, to see their facility. The problem with Jeff is he's been distracted. I think he got really into the Amazon Prime Video, so he was spending a lot of time in Hollywood. So he wasn't even in Washington a lot. And then he got really dragged into the Khashoggi stuff with his email. That was a really ugly situation. I thought he sort of stood up for himself and sort of journalism pretty well through that whole episode. It certainly made me nice to know that some people had journalist backs, but now that he's sort of moving beyond that, he will have more time. And I think that's going to be very important for Blue.
Yeah. I'm glad there's money going into journalism. The loss of journalists is one of the biggest threats to democracy. I think we could talk about that. And I was like one of the Washington Post delivery boys of the year in 1982. I have a little plaque for being a Washington Post delivery
Look, I
Um,
mean, journalists are easy scapegoats, and there's a lot of
yeah,
really bad journalism
yeah,
in this country and around the world.
yeah,
Um, and the media landscape is troubled. However,
yeah.
I think a good canary in the coal mine for a nation's health is how it treats its journalists. Because if it cracks down on journalists, imprisons them, disappears them, or sort of attacks them, then that's a sign of an unhealthy government, because it's not a government that's willing to withstand any sort of public scrutiny.
Absolutely. I think it's how you treat journalists is like the most important litmus test for a government. We talked about in China, my friend has been arrested without cause. Russia, I think several hundred journalists have been killed over the last 20 years in Russia. It's insane. Jamal Khashoggi got killed by the
Mm-hmm.
Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the president completely had the Saudis back and said it's okay. They spend $200 billion on arms. We're not going to rock the cart, which is one of the most astounding statements that a U.S. president could make. But yeah, journalism. We need to have another podcast, Eric, because we got to talk about the moon. We got to talk about journalism. We got to talk about hurricane. We talked about winter storms. The hurricane season's coming up here in a few months, so
Well, I'm happy to come back anytime, Terry.
we'll have to do it. We have to talk about the Astros too. I'm afraid we're at the end of an era with the Astros.
We'll see. We'll see.
This year may be good, but we'll see. So, all right, well, let's go watch the NASA press conference.
Yes.
What's going
Yes.
on Mars? That's in a few minutes as
Yes.
we're recording this. Well, thanks for coming on. This was great. Again, I'll do another plug for Liftoff, your book, and about the history of SpaceX. It's going to be super interesting, and I can't wait to read it. I have to get a copy.
All right. Well, that sounds great, Terry. Thank
All
you.
right, we'll talk later, and thanks for being one of my first guests on Down to Earth. Appreciate it. Talk to you later, Eric.
My pleasure. Bye, Terry.
Bye.